The Killing of JonBenet, The Final Suspects, is hosted by me, Danielle Robay. Executive produced by Dylan Howard and Matt Sprouse, and is a production of Broad and Water Studios and Endeavor Audio. Executive producers also include Tom Freestone, Doug Longini, Susan Bennett, Susan Bennett, Susan Bennett.
Hello and welcome to the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science. In this episode, which is the first in a brand new series on debunking the Killing of JonBenet podcast, we'll be looking at, and don't laugh, basically just the first 3 minutes of the first episode. So I think the full episode is 34 minutes. We're only going to be looking at the first 3 minutes. If you want to waste your time listening to the rest, that's up to you. If you do waste your time listening to the rest, please let me know what else is sort of brought up that is interesting, whether it's something that you think is very pertinent or whether it's nonsensical. I'd be interested to hear. I'm certainly not going to waste my time listening to the entire episode to do sort of a blow-by-blow analysis. Having said that, you should find the analysis just of the first 3 minutes of this first episode pretty compelling anyway. The clip that I played at the beginning of this episode introduces someone called Susan Bennett. Now, Susan Bennett isn't identified there as Jameson, and later on, when Jameson is identified, she's not identified as Susan Bennett, which is the first little mindfuckery that's sort of going on in this documentary. So, in this podcast. And so, but I'm not going to get to that right now. I'm going to leave that for just a little bit later. What is interesting is that this podcast sort of opens with Patsy Ramsey's voice calling 911. It's that sort of well-known 911 call. And, you know, it's so obvious, but it's also so obvious that people don't seem to notice. Patsy Ramsey hung up on her own 911 call. Just think about that for a second. You get a 3-page ransom note, ostensibly. Your daughter's missing, and you are now calling to report an emergency. And you know, the operator hears what you're saying and wants some details. How long has your child been gone? What does the note say? You know, what's her name? What is JonBenet's name? You know, and all that kind of thing. And Patsy's basically hangs up on the call, or she tries to hang up. That's something else that's also not brought up, I guess, in the opening episode. Maybe it's a bit unfair to say that it should have been mentioned that the phone wasn't properly sort of hung up, but that is something that I covered in my investigation into the case, which is there's a, I don't want to even call it a rumor, there's a theory that after Patsy hung the phone up, you could sort of hear noises or voices in the background. Now, you can look at it two ways. You can either say that Patsy herself didn't properly cradle the phone, right? And this caused the operator to carry on listening, and we know that she did. This is actually mentioned in the CBS documentary that she wasn't even called to testify about that particular aspect, and she was like, you know, I heard stuff, and then all people want to sort of focus on is what the digital noise suggests, instead of talking to her, the actual operator who said she heard something. In any event, whether you believe that there were noises or not, the fact is that the call was hung up, that Patsy Ramsey hung up on her own call without giving virtually any information. And then, but the part that I found really interesting, when I investigated this case was, I was sort of asking the question, would it have been possible to kind of hang up a phone when it was, a phone that was sort of a vertical phone, if I can put it that way. So bear in mind at that time they sort of used landlines a lot. They didn't use cell phones. And this was 1996. And there was a phone in the kitchen that was sort of vertically available, right? So in other words, if you didn't put the phone on the hook properly, the phone would literally just slide off and sort of dangle on the ground, or dangle in the air and sort of swing around. And somebody would notice that. In other words, if you put the phone not quite on the hook and it slid off, you would know that you'd made a mistake and you would put it on properly, right? So that to me suggested that that wasn't the phone used to call 911. And so the question was, well, where else could she have called from? And there were a couple of options. One was John's study, which was upstairs on the second floor, and the other one was the study in the lounge area, sort of on the close to the garage. That was another option. But then there was also the phone in the basement, and that phone we have a photo of, and that phone is resting kind of on a horizontal surface. And think about a basement. There's not, the lighting down there isn't even good, even when the lights are on. I don't know whether they would want the lights on at that time of the morning, the Ramseys. In any event, what appears to have happened is that Patsy made the call, ended the call prematurely but purposefully, and then kind of she seemed to hurriedly hang up. But because she was in such a hurry, she didn't quite hang up properly, and hence you had this muffled sort of noises going through. That's another story, is to talk about what these noises represented. But some people thought that you could hear John, Patsy, and Burke's voice on the phone. But regardless of all that, you can say, well, we don't know this for sure, we don't know that for sure. What we do know for sure is that Patsy herself hung up on her own 911 call. And I think that tells you a lot about what to expect from the Ramseys going forward after that, in terms of how they wanted the case investigated. If you just look at the pageantry of the call itself, her out of breath and so on, and then she's so panicky and out of breath, and then she throws the phone down before she's really even communicated anything. And you've got to also ask the question, why is Patsy in a hurry? I mean, she's in a hurry for people to urgently come to her home, but it's not like the operator needs to get off the phone so that she can drive to the Ramsey's home. It's not like she's got to get off the phone so she can get in her car. If anything, if Patsy stays on the phone, any police officers in the area can come over quite quickly, because they're given all the information they need. But Patsy elects to kind of get off the phone, and this brings us to another voice that sort of appears in the in this podcast, like pretty early on. You sort of, after hearing the 911 call, you hear kind of an old woman's voice, not identified, and she sort of, in a kind of a croaking voice, talks about how JonBenet was tortured and murdered, and in a town without a homicide department, and because they didn't have any homicides, and she says it's horrifying. So you've kind of got this fairly elderly woman, as I say, who's not identified, and she's sort of talking about just how horrifying this whole thing is. It's sort of like the sort of shock value of it. Well, that older woman's voice you would sort of hear later on, just sort of after some kind of contextual information about the podcast, and she would then be identified as someone who calls herself Jameson, but it's the same person's voice. And we're going to deal with Jameson in a moment, but if you pay attention to what this woman says, she says JonBenet was tortured and murdered in a town without a homicide department. I'm not sure how much in that statement is actually true. If you say that JonBenet was tortured, what are we talking about? Are we saying that she was tortured by an adult? Are we saying that she was tortured? In what way? In what way was she tortured? And that's often not mentioned. And if she was tortured, why didn't she cry out? Quite simple. So JonBenet was tortured before she was murdered, so why didn't she cry out? It's a serious question. It's a serious question. And if you're listening to this and you also pretty agitated by this whole thing, you should maybe leave a comment on the podcast and just ask the question or tweet it somewhere. But I'll tell you why it's an important question is if some kind of stranger had broken into the home, as the Ramseys claim, and as this podcast is trying to claim with this ridiculous assertion of final suspects, right? Then why didn't JonBenet shout out? She's in her home. Her brother's just down the corridor. Her parents are upstairs. They're both in the home. Why couldn't she just cry out? Quite simple. And I know some people would say, well, because she had duct tape on her mouth. No, she didn't. The duct tape had Patsy's fibers on the inside of it, which means those fibers couldn't have gotten there until very, very late in this whole story. And it's very unlikely that some kind of intruder would have somehow found the time to put Patsy's fibers on the duct tape and then put it onto JonBenet's mouth. You would think that most intruders, stranger intruders, would basically go straight to JonBenet, take her somewhere safe in terms of the thing that he wants to do, and then do whatever he's going to do with the duct tape applied immediately. Why would he sort of go and get Patsy's fibers, and where would he get them, right? Anyway, the whole thing is absolutely ridiculous, and I don't think that JonBenet had any duct tape over her mouth. And so you've got to say, why didn't she scream if she didn't have duct tape over her mouth? And then I think Lou Smith's story is that she was kind of tasered, and that's why she didn't scream out. Really? So you tasered, and that's not going to stop you from screaming out. Surely being tasered is going to make you scream out. What about somebody coming into your room that you don't know with a taser, and you're being tasered not once but multiple times? Why wouldn't you scream out? So even the taser, I think, is a bogus theory. But the question is ultimately, why didn't this little girl scream out? And there's quite a simple answer. It's because she volunteered to, or she went along with some kind of game that eventually became, you could call it torture. I don't like the word torture, but it escalated. And so it was something that she consented to, and then it got out of hand, and then it got really out of hand. And this whole question of screaming is, I think JonBenet did scream, but she screamed when things got to a point that she wasn't happy with, and that was when she was murdered. And she wasn't murdered to murder her, she was murdered to keep her quiet. That's totally different. I mean, the intention was to harm her and to, silence her, and whoever did it was very deliberate about it. So you can't say that it was accidental. I don't think it's certainly not premeditated murder, although the torture game before is kind of premeditated. It's probably something that was going on for quite a while. So when Jameson, Susan Bennett, talks about this torture, you've got to see it in context. Did JonBenet have bruises. I mean, ostensible bruises on her face, on her, on her genitals. Was she tortured in a visible way? Well, when you see her body lying on the carpet, it doesn't look like that, does it? She actually looks fine. There's no sort of clear outward appearance of torture, is there? And then this lady talking about this talks about a town without a homicide department. I don't know whether that's true. I mean, Boulder was a kind of a small town. It didn't have a lot of crime, but somebody saying that it was a town completely without a homicide department doesn't sound accurate to me. And if I know Jameson, in terms of her online identity, it's a tricksy way of saying that, oh, well, actually, it did have a homicide department, but because it was Christmas, no one was around. So technically they had a homicide department, but in reality, in terms of the situation, no one was around, so they didn't have a homicide department. But to say this in the opening spiel of this podcast, which she's also the executive producer of, is kind of a little misleading, don't you think? And so if we go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, and bear in mind it's this person talking about this town, this perfect town where that apparently didn't have a homicide department. If you go in Lawrence Schiller's book, he sort of refers to the fact that there were even victim advocates present at the Ramsey home. Bob Whitson was the on-duty supervisor at police headquarters. And interestingly, Bob Whitson identifies himself in this podcast as Robert Whitson. Anyway, he was actually responsible for kind of a lot of the bungling that went on, and he actually admits it in parts. The guy that kind of knew what was going on was Detective Sergeant Larry Mason, and guess what happened to him? He was fired within about the first 10 days of the investigation. And then you've got to ask, if you really want the police to investigate a case, do you start having people fired, or you try and have people actually working the case? What is it showing when people are fired when they're investigating certain things compared to when they're allowed to do their jobs? And in the McCann case and the Ramsey case, you have exactly the same situation. In the McCann case, it took about 3 months for the lead detective to be fired, but it also took about that time for the McCanns to actually submit themselves to police questioning. In the Ramsey case, it took also about 3 months, maybe even more, I think April, so it was 4 months for the Ramseys to submit to questioning. And by then, of course, Mason had also been fired, and later on, Detective Thomas also resigned in frustration. But if you're talking about the credibility of the police, and this is what Jameson loves to do, it's kind of what she gravitates to is attacking the credibility of others. And of course, when her credibility is analyzed, it doesn't stand up very well. It really doesn't stand up very well. But we'll get to that. So Detective Jane Harmer was part of the police department, but she was on vacation at the time of this crime, and she'd attended a seminar taught by the FBI's Child Abduction Serial Killer Unit. So there were people that had training. So to say that this was a town without resources is absolute garbage. Of course, a crime happening on Christmas or Christmas morning or the day after Christmas is going to be difficult for any department where people are on leave. And so interestingly, because Sergeant Whitson, who was the supervisor on duty, he knew that Harmer had a copy of the FBI's manual on procedures to follow, but he didn't know where it was. So you've got this guy who is participating in this podcast, not Detective Harmer, but Whitson, who kind of made an early bungle by just not being able to find this manual that they actually had. And I think it took him something like half an hour or something to find out where it was, but they did find it. And it basically set out an FBI protocol. And one thing that one can acknowledge is Boulder PD hadn't officially adopted the FBI protocol at that time. So they had it, they just hadn't kind of implemented it yet. And this was kind of an opportunity to do so. Then there was also the way that Larry Mason, he arrived at police headquarters because he was paged by Detective Arndt, and she said she needed backup, and yeah, she did. She said that she was, as Lawrence Schiller describes it in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, that she was the only police officer in a 15-room, 3-story house with 9 civilians, all of whom were in emotional distress. That's from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. And so, yeah, clearly Detective Arndt was in a pickle. And even Mason said he couldn't understand why the officers on the scene hadn't secured the house earlier, hadn't separated the Ramseys, hadn't questioned them individually. But then he found out that Commander Eller had ordered, this is the command of Boulder PD, had ordered that the Ramseys be treated as victims instead of as suspects. And this was, he said, according to Lawrence Schiller, Eller had said, the Ramseys are an influential family, so, just sort of be careful of them. And that's really the bottom line here. Is because the Ramseys were influential, it was their influence that kept the police at bay and kind of controlled how the case was being investigated, starting with a ransom note. Patsy hanging up on her own call was her way of controlling what was being asked of her. It was her setting the tone, her setting the pace, her deciding how much she was going to say, and when she'd said enough, she would hang up. And you kind of had that same kind of tone with regard to whether they should have polygraph tests or whether they should talk to when they were going to talk to the Boulder PD and on and on and on and on. And again, all of this is just referring to the first 3 minutes of that podcast. The podcast refers to the case as an unsolved murder, which I don't think it is. I think it's officially unsolved, but you'd have to be an idiot to say that nobody has any clue about what actually happened here. In the first 3 minutes of the podcast, it's also described, the investigation is described as a witch hunt directed at JonBenet's parents. No, it's not. It's not a witch hunt. The Ramsey ransom note alone justifies a serious look at least one of the parents in the Ramsey case. And one can make a huge case about that alone. But I just think it's important to stress that this podcast is, without any hesitation, without any doubt, without any uncertainty, it's absolute apologia. It's meant to massage the story of the case against the Ramseys, and it's meant to open the door to a revolving door of suspects. It's meant to close the door on whatever anyone suspects about the Ramseys and open the door to question mark, right? And when this case, again, when it's described as unsolved, it seems like the producers and the makers of this particular product have really bad amnesia. It just seems like they have selective amnesia. There was a grand jury investigation into this case, and what the grand jury voted was to indict the parents. Are these people just unaware of that? Like, is that just not... Did that not happen? Did 12 people not vote to indict 2 people with 2 indictments apiece? Why is that not mentioned? Why isn't that mentioned right in the beginning? You know, as one of the bottom line issues in terms of this case. And then the episode plays a clip of Patsy giving a press conference, and this press conference was, I think, on the 1st of April. I think it was on May 1st that press conference was held. The interviews with Boulder PD were on the last day of April, so the 31st of April. So it wasn't April Fool's Day, it was May Fool's Day. And in that press conference was basically the first one I think the Ramseys had ever given to the local media. You may remember that their first interview was to CNN in Atlanta, right, which is sort of going over the head of the local media and also kind of the police. And so 4 months later, after speaking to the police, they finally have their press conference. People described it as such a slick PR package that it backfired on the Ramseys just because of the way it looked, with all the lawyers present and all the conditions and everything else. In any event, at that PR extravaganza, Patsy said, I think it's crazy to think that John or I was involved. I did not kill JonBenet. I loved that child. And that's kind of something to look at is I'm sure Patsy did love her child, but how did she love her child? What is the quality of that love? What is the quality of that care and attention? Given that she was ultimately, the grand jury ultimately voted to indict her, Patsy, for child abuse resulting in death. So I'm sure she did love her daughter, but was there something that she didn't do? Was there something that she didn't attend to? And again, if you look at Patsy's behavior with making the 911 call, if you were in that situation, would you hang up on calling the police? Would you do that? And so this podcast series promises to be the most exhaustive investigation into the Ramsey case in decades. It's quite a grand statement, wouldn't you say? It's only been 2 decades and 3 years since the event. So to say the most exhaustive investigation in decades, well, they've only been 2 decades. So you can barely say the word decades with an S. And I don't think it's true. I don't think it's the most exhaustive investigation in decades just based on what you've already heard. Calling it an unsolved case in your first episode doesn't make it feel very exhaustive. Calling it a witch hunt against her parents doesn't make it feel very exhaustive. Quoting Jameson right in the beginning of your whole series basically discredits the whole series, in my opinion. Because Jameson discredited herself. She pretended to be a man for a long time. I've had my run-ins as well where there's a blog site or an encyclopedia page that misquotes or misattributes me as the author of the Craven Silence series. And it then also links, the same misquoting then links to 3 reviews in inverted commas of Jameson 245 talking about how garbage my work is. And please don't read it. Whenever you ever heard of somebody saying to somebody else, don't read that. I mean, even what I said at the beginning of this episode to say, I think these podcasts are going to be nonsense, they're going to be apologia. I'm not saying don't listen to them. You can listen to them and report back on what you think is nonsensical. I do think it's going to be a waste of time, though. I'm not saying don't listen to them. But something like a book, when someone's written a book, why on earth would you say don't read it, and not just in terms of one book, but many? Why would you do that? And it's different to saying that to actually doing what I'm doing, where you're actually debunking what someone's trying to say. In other words, you're showing with evidence and information that what you're being told is potentially very misleading. There's a total difference between that. We take what they say and then you address it. What Jameson 245 does in her reviews is she kind of satirizes and parodies and undermines and tries to discredit. But what she seems to be doing is trying to discredit the writer, not the actual content. Otherwise, go through it like I am. Go through it thoroughly. Go through it episode by episode. At 3 minutes into episode 1, you actually hear some journalist called Doug talking to who they refer to as an unlikely expert from North Carolina. And this is where the cagey mindfuckery starts. Is instead of saying who we're talking to is Susan Bennett from Hickory, North Carolina, identify this person. Just be honest about who you're talking to. They introduce her by her moniker, Jameson. Now you're supposed to figure out what that's supposed to mean. And what Jameson says is, guess what? We have a finite list now of loose-smith suspects. So as far as I know, if I'm reading between the lines, Susan Bennett kind of inherited the case files, I think, of one of the Ramsey investigators, one of the Ramsey detectives. And by that I don't mean someone investigated the Ramseys, I mean someone investigated for them. I'm not sure if it was Armistead or someone else, but she inherited that, and with that the loose-smith sort of list of suspects. And she's now trying to sell this not only as apologia, but I wonder how much this podcast is earning based on this sort of bogus thing, this bogus thing of the final suspects. Because you must remember, the podcast is executive produced also by Susan Bennett. And Susan Bennett owns this list, and that's the corner piece, it's the centerpiece of this whole series, which is to talk about the final suspects. So it sounds to me like Susan Bennett kind of took this information and she's built around this entire episode that is basically built around this thing that she has. And that's one thing, but then why wouldn't you identify yourself? Why wouldn't you just make it plain how you got it, where you got it from, who you are, and all that kind of thing? And you can say it's unfair just at the 3-minute mark to say that she hasn't identified herself, but why on earth wouldn't you? Why on earth wouldn't you identify your name in the beginning, right in the beginning, just say, this is who I am? And this is something that I find happens a lot with true crime, is I often have people very confidently maligning me, attacking me, trying to discredit me, but then they refuse to provide their own credentials. So just think about those words. You're discrediting someone else, but you don't provide your own credentials. You don't say who you are. You don't say what your background is. And in other words, you have a bunch of people that are anonymous discrediting someone, and that person who's the subject of these discrediting attacks can't respond because all these people are anonymous. Not only is that not fair, it's dishonest, it's disingenuous, and it's part of the whole mindfuckery going along around this case. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to educate you guys on Jameson or Sue Bennett. You guys are welcome to read up about her. There is a lot that she said. All I'm going to alert you guys to is an article where Erin Moriarty is interviewing her. This is Sue Bennett, and she says, Jameson doesn't mince words. He just comes out and says the Ramseys are innocent. So here you've got Sue Bennett on television talking about Jameson as though Jameson is somebody else and that it's a he. Can you see how misleading it is? Can you see how elaborate the mindfuckery is, even in the glare of the media? Do you see that? And she says, I mean, it's just crazy, just like she said in this opening thing here where she talks about how horrifying this crime was. And this is from acandyrose.com, who also has a serious bone to pick with Jameson / Susan Bennett. And it is, she says, if there's something wrong with my examples, I don't believe that there's anyone that should give him any credibility. And that's exactly, that boils down Jameson and Susan Bennett to kind of a T, is that she's all about discrediting other people. In fact, I would just make it even shorter than that. She's all about discrediting. That's all that she's kind of been doing for years. And Susan Bennett is mentioned in the Ramsey's book. She's thanked in the Ramsey's book. There's talk about them meeting face to face in the Ramsey's book. And the question definitely arises, and you know, it's obvious, but is there any actual relationship? Is there any is Susan Bennett a connection, a family connection to JonBenet Ramsey? And I don't really care if you say there is no connection. You can say, well, there's no family connection except that they have similar family names. Well, if there's no family connection, why is this pretty much the most visible, acknowledged, well-known cybersoldier in the whole Ramsey canon? And she's done all of this for the Ramseys, almost like a full-time job. At one point, she earned $40,000 for selling information to a particular tabloid, as far as I know. So this is someone who's made it her life, and she's, you know, I'm a true crime writer. I've written about this case and moved on. Why would somebody stick to a case like this for years and years and years and years? Why would she inherit case files? Why wouldn't the Ramseys inherit it? And it goes even further. Susan Jameson Bennett, and this is from a Candy Rose, wanted to appear before the grand jury. And this was in February 1999. And she said, I formally requested to be allowed to speak to the grand jury, blah, 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 blah. And I'm guessing now, this is pure conjecture, but I'm guessing what she wanted to testify to was the fact that she once worked in a factory in Hickory that made the special kind of duct tape that was found in the Ramsey home. And she has this inside knowledge that it was only produced in November 1996. And how could this duct tape then have appeared on the shelves in time to be purchased and to be in the Ramsey home in December 1996? And this I'm guessing is what she wanted to testify towards, is that I guess the evidence is wrong, or you know, there was no way the Ramseys could have had that duct tape. And so, to their credit, the grand jury didn't allow her to testify, and from what I gather, Jameson told everybody that the reason that she wasn't was just because the protocols of how she approached the district attorney or the district attorney's office wasn't right, and so that was why she wasn't allowed to testify. And so, very interestingly, and it's not something you see often on the acandyrose.com website, is you see a big square box where Jameson is sort of pointed out in a very serious way. And she says, this webmaster of this site wants to comment on the internet post who goes under the last name of Jameson, who appeared on the CBS special as one Susan Bennett of North Carolina, quoted on the show, where she says Jameson didn't mince words. He just came out and says the Ramseys are innocent. In Susan Bennett's quote above, she refers to Jameson as a he. Jameson said that Donald Foster saw one word he, and Foster determined Jameson was a male. How is it that Susan Jameson Bennett still references herself as a he in April 8th, 1999, and yet she condemns Donald Foster for thinking she was a male poster on the Boulder News Forum under the name hat of Jameson in June 1997. So you can see someone very upset by the mindfuckery that was going on around this particular poster because of what was being said in a manipulating and misleading way, not only online but also on television. And now you have the same person kind of headlining this particular podcast. So for those of you who do want to take the time to listen to it, and as I say, you guys are welcome to, please keep your ears open and your eyes peeled for all the statements made by this elderly lady who's identified as Jameson. And yeah, let's make a list of everything that she says and just check it out. Check out what she's saying, what she's trying to convince the listeners of. And we can definitely go into that. But until then, I'm not looking further than the first 3 minutes of the first episode. And I'll be back later, maybe next week, with episode 2 or whenever the next episode comes out. If it does come out and you're aware of it, please let me know, and I'll look into it and do a similar kind of brief analysis.